My name is Harper. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside organizations where people speak softly about leadership, trust, and growth, while quietly measuring who absorbs risk and who escapes it. If you ask the people who worked around me back then, they would probably describe me the same way: calm, dependable, not flashy. The kind of woman you don't worry about because she doesn't make noise. The kind you assume will handle it. I've learned that when you move through the world without dramatics, without demanding to be seen, people often mistake that for a lack of awareness. Or worse, a lack of choice. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing villains or humiliating anyone. There are no shouting matches, no courtroom monologues, no last-minute triumphs that come from luck. What happened to me unfolded quietly, through emails, meetings, and titles that sounded impressive but felt strangely hollow once you stood inside them. It's the story of the moment I realized that the role I had been given, deputy director, wasn't power at all. It was insulation, a name designed to carry weight without authority, responsibility without control, and eventually accountability for debt that wasn't truly mine. For a long time, I didn't see it that way. I told myself I was being trusted, that I was being prepared for something bigger, that patience was maturity and silence was professionalism. But this isn't a story about how I was fooled once. It's about how small signals, repeated over time, teach you exactly where you stand, if you're willing to look without flinching. You won't hear me describe myself as a victim. I stayed longer than I should have. I accepted explanations that felt thin because they were delivered calmly. I believed that doing the work well would eventually protect me. What changed wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a betrayal that exploded outward. It was a quiet internal shift, the kind that happens when the facts line up so cleanly that denial becomes more exhausting than truth. In telling this, I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm offering a record, an honest one, about how organizations sometimes assign titles the way they assign liability, about how women who lead without noise are often positioned as buffers, useful precisely because they don't draw attention, and about what happens when silence stops being reflexive and becomes intentional. If you've ever been trusted with responsibility but excluded from power, if you've ever been praised for handling things while others made the decisions, you might recognize parts of yourself in what follows. Before we go further, I want to ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever accepted a role that sounded like recognition, only to realize later it was a form of containment? To them, I was reliable in the way furniture is reliable. I was the person already seated when the meeting began, notebook open, pen uncapped, the one who stayed behind when others drifted out to their next obligation. If something broke quietly, it was assumed I would notice. If something failed loudly, it was assumed I would help clean it up. No one said this out loud. That's not how these things are assigned. They settle into place through habit. In the company directory, my title carried weight: Deputy Director of Operations. It sounded like proximity to power. To outsiders, it suggested authority. To new hires, it meant I was one of the decision makers. Inside the building, it meant something else. I wasn't invisible exactly. I was seen, but only in a specific frame. The dependable one, the calm one, the person who didn't escalate, the person who could be trusted not to embarrass leadership by reacting emotionally. People came to me with problems they didn't want to carry upstairs. They'd stand in my doorway and lower their voices. "Can you take a look at this? Can you smooth this over? Can you explain this in a way that won't cause friction?" I rarely said no, not because I was afraid, but because I genuinely believed that competence accumulated. That if you consistently held things together, eventually you'd be invited into the room where things were decided, not just repaired. I told myself this was what leadership looked like before it became visible. In meetings, I spoke carefully. I asked clarifying questions, not declarative ones. When ideas were presented that I knew would create downstream problems, I framed my concerns as logistics, not objections. It wasn't submission, it was strategy, or so I thought at the time. Others spoke with certainty. I spoke with precision. And precision, I learned, is easy to ignore. When credit was assigned, my name hovered in the background. People would say operations handled it, or that was taken care of already. The passive voice did a lot of work in that building. It allowed outcomes to exist without ownership. I didn't interrupt that narrative. I thought dignity meant not insisting. What I didn't realize yet was how neatly I fit the role they needed someone to play. I was steady, which meant I could absorb pressure. I was detail-oriented, which meant I could be trusted with risk. I didn't posture, which meant no one worried I'd challenge a decision publicly. There's a particular way people look at you when they believe you won't make things difficult. It's not disrespectful, it's relieved. That look followed me everywhere. When a senior director missed a deadline, I was asked to step in temporarily. When a contract came back with ambiguous language, legal CC'd me just to be safe. When numbers didn't reconcile cleanly, finance asked if I could walk them through operations side. I was proud of being the bridge. Bridges don't get thanked, they get used. At the time, I didn't resent it. I had a quiet confidence in my own value. I believed that being central, even if unseen, meant being indispensable. What I didn't understand was that indispensability without visibility doesn't protect you. It positions you. If you had asked me then how I thought leadership saw me, I would have said capable, trusted, seen. If you asked how they used me, the answer would have been simpler. As a buffer. I buffered conflict, I buffered accountability, I buffered risk. And because I never dramatized the weight, no one questioned how much I was carrying. There was no single moment in this phase where I felt wronged. That's important. Nothing felt sharp enough to protest. Everything was reasonable, temporary, framed as trust. That's how these roles are built. Not through force, but through alignment. You're chosen because you won't resist the shape they need. Looking back now, I can see how early it started, how smoothly it fit, how my calm became a convenience. But at the time, I thought I was simply being professional, being mature, being prepared for what came next. I didn't yet understand that for some organizations, what comes next is never power. It's liability. The first time it happened, it was small enough to dismiss. That's what makes these moments dangerous. Not their severity, but their deniability. We were in a mid-level strategy meeting, the kind that sits just below executive review. Too detailed for the board, too consequential to be casual. I had spent the previous week reviewing operational exposure tied to a new expansion plan, vendor dependencies, payment timelines, penalty clauses buried in the contracts. Nothing dramatic, just math and language. When the conversation reached the rollout schedule, I spoke up, calmly, the way I always did. I said that the projected cash flow assumed payment terms that hadn't actually been negotiated yet, that if even two vendors enforced standard terms, we'd be carrying a short-term liability that operations couldn't absorb without adjustments. The room went quiet for a beat. Then one of the directors smiled, not unkindly, and said, "Let's not get bogged down in hypotheticals. We'll cross that bridge when we get there." A few people nodded. Someone else shifted the slide forward. And just like that, the conversation moved on. No one challenged me. No one argued. No one said I was wrong. They simply stepped over it. I felt a brief, unfamiliar sensation. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something closer to disorientation, like realizing you'd spoken a sentence out loud and no one had registered sound. I told myself it was fine. Meetings have momentum. Not every point lands. I made a note in my notebook, underlined the vendor names, and assumed we'd return to it later. We didn't. After the meeting, two colleagues stopped by my office separately. One said, "You were right about the cash flow thing." The other said, "Good catch, by the way. That could get messy." Both said it quietly, privately, as if agreement belonged off the record. Neither of them raised it publicly. Neither followed up in writing. That was the cut, not the dismissal in the meeting. That happens everywhere. It was the way validation arrived only after the risk of visibility had passed. I began to notice how often that pattern repeated. Concerns acknowledged in hallways. Agreement whispered over coffee. Praise delivered in private where it couldn't change anything. Publicly, the narrative remained smooth, confident, optimistic. I started to pay closer attention. Not with suspicion, but with curiosity. In subsequent meetings, I tested it. I'd flag a risk gently, without urgency. I'd phrase it as a question or a timing issue or just something to keep in mind. Each time the response followed the same arc. Brief pause, polite deflection, forward motion. And later, always later, someone would circle back to say, "You might want to keep an eye on that." As if watching was the same as influencing. I didn't protest. I didn't escalate. I told myself this was about priorities, not power. That leadership had a broader view. That I was seeing trees while they saw the forest. But something subtle had changed in me. I stopped assuming that being correct was enough. I began to feel the difference between being heard and being registered. There's a professional instinct many of us develop, especially women, to soften our insights so they don't disrupt momentum, to be helpful rather than definitive, to trust that reason will eventually surface on its own. I had mastered that instinct. What I hadn't mastered yet was recognizing when it was being used against me. Because each time a concern was dismissed publicly and acknowledged privately, it reinforced a quiet division of labor. I would hold the risk, they would hold the authority, and everyone would pretend those two things belonged together. The company culture rewarded composure. It punished friction, not overtly, but through omission. The people who spoke with confidence, even when they were wrong, were remembered. The people who spoke with caution, even when they were right, were tolerated. I told myself I preferred it this way, that I didn't need credit, that outcomes mattered more than acknowledgement. But that first small cut had landed somewhere deeper than I realized. It planted a question I didn't yet have the language for. If I'm trusted to see the risk, why am I not trusted to shape the decision? I didn't ask it out loud. Not yet. What happens slowly doesn't announce itself as harm. It presents as routine. After that first dismissal, nothing worsened dramatically. There were no raised voices, no overt undermining. In fact, on the surface, things looked stable. My title remained intact. My workload increased. My access to information, not authority, expanded. That's how I normalized it. I told myself this was just how complex organizations worked, that leadership filtered input, that not every warning needed to alter direction, that my job was to inform, not decide. I repeated those explanations often enough that they began to feel like facts. When my calendar filled with meetings I didn't set, I saw it as trust. When documents came to me after decisions were already made, I called it efficiency. When I was asked to handle the details, I framed it as alignment with my strengths. The truth sat underneath all of that, waiting. I was being positioned as the person who would make other people's decisions executable, regardless of their consequences. The disrespect wasn't loud, it was procedural. I'd receive finalized plans with a note that said, "Looping you in." I'd be CC'd on emails after commitments had been made externally. I'd be asked to find a way, once the way had already been chosen. At first, I worked around the flaws quietly, adjusted timelines, renegotiated terms, smoothed over gaps with vendors who trusted me because I spoke carefully and delivered what I promised. Every fix made the original decision look smarter than it was. Every workaround erased evidence of risk. And each time I compensated for someone else's overconfidence, I trained the organization to rely on that compensation. I remember one afternoon in particular. A contract had been signed with a penalty clause that activated if certain operational benchmarks weren't met within 90 days. I'd flagged that clause weeks earlier. It had been waved off as unlikely. Now it was very likely. When I brought it up, the response was measured, almost reassuring. "Well, operations has always found a way before," one executive said. "I'm confident you'll figure this out too." "Not we, you." I nodded, took notes, asked for nothing. That night, I stayed late, recalculating schedules and reallocating internal resources to avoid triggering the penalty. I didn't record the extra hours, I didn't document the near miss. I told myself I was protecting the company. What I was really doing was protecting the illusion that decisions had been sound. There's a quiet pressure that builds when you're the one who absorbs fallout. It doesn't feel like coercion, it feels like responsibility. And responsibility, when praised, can become addictive. People trusted me with increasingly sensitive information, financial exposure, vendor disputes, internal tensions they didn't want escalated. They'd say things like, "I'm glad you're on this," or "This feels safer in your hands." I took that as respect. I didn't see how narrow the lane was becoming. I was allowed to know. I was allowed to fix. I was not allowed to redirect. Anytime I considered pushing back more forcefully, I hesitated. I worried about being labeled difficult, about being seen as obstructive, about undermining leadership confidence. So I softened my language even further. Instead of "this will fail," I said, "there may be some challenges." Instead of "we're exposed here," I said, "we should monitor this closely." Instead of "this isn't sustainable," I said, "let's revisit once we have more data." I became fluent in caution. And caution, I learned, is easy to disregard. What made this phase especially dangerous was that no one treated me poorly. They were polite, grateful even. They just didn't change their behavior. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through consistency. Each time I stayed quiet, it felt justified. Each time I stepped in to fix something quietly, it felt necessary. Each time I accepted responsibility without authority, it felt temporary. Until one day, I realized I was no longer waiting for a different role. I was performing the one they'd already assigned me, and everyone seemed very comfortable with that arrangement. Everyone except me. The role wasn't written down anywhere. That's the thing about these arrangements. They don't appear in job descriptions. They emerge through repetition, through what's expected of you without being stated, through the work that always lands on your desk and never on anyone else's. I realized it during a leadership offsite, not the kind with trust falls or slogans. This one was framed as alignment. 2 days of presentations, forecasts, and long conversations about where the company was headed. I was invited, of course, my title justified it. But my function became clear within the first morning. I was there to answer questions, not to ask them. Whenever operational risk came up, eyes turned toward me. I clarified timelines, explained constraints, translated ambition into logistics. When discussions drifted into financial territory, especially debt exposure or deferred obligations, someone would say, "Harper can speak to that." I spoke, carefully, accurately, and then the conversation moved on without incorporating what I'd said. By the second afternoon, a pattern had formed so cleanly it was almost elegant. They debated direction. I explained consequences. They chose direction anyway. I was expected to make it survivable. That was the role. Reliable, useful, invisible. I wasn't part of the force that pushed the company forward. I was the surface it leaned on to avoid tipping over. During one session, a senior executive summarized it without realizing. "We need Harper close to this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the plan on the screen. "She keeps things grounded." Grounded. The word landed differently than intended. Grounded doesn't fly. Grounded absorbs impact. I smiled politely and made another note in my notebook. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I reviewed the materials again. For the first time, I didn't focus on whether the plan could work. I focused on where failure would land if it didn't. The answer was uncomfortably clear. Operational shortfalls would be traced back to execution. Execution lived under my department. Financial strain would be framed as operational inefficiency. And I was the operational lead with a title high enough to hold accountable, but not high enough to deflect responsibility upward. That's when I understood what deputy director really meant in practice. It wasn't a stepping stone. It was a buffer zone, high enough to absorb blame, low enough to lack protection. The title gave the appearance of authority without granting the mechanisms of power. I didn't approve budgets. I didn't set strategy. I didn't sign final contracts. But I was deeply embedded in all of it. If something went wrong, I would be asked why it hadn't been anticipated. If something went right, it would be framed as evidence that the strategy had been sound. I thought back to every moment I'd been told, "We trust you with this," or "You're so good at handling complexity." I could see now how trust had been narrowly defined. They trusted me to carry weight, not to redirect it. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The meetings after that felt different. Not because anyone behaved differently, but because I was finally watching the right thing. I noticed how often risk flowed downward and credit flowed up, how accountability stopped just short of decision makers, how my calm was relied upon to keep questions from becoming obstacles. No one had tricked me. That's important to say. I had agreed to this role piece by piece. Each time it was reasonable. Each time it felt aligned with my values. Each time it was framed as temporary. The danger wasn't malice. It was design. And design, once recognized, demands a response. I didn't make one yet. But I stopped assuming I was misunderstood. I was understood perfectly. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment where someone finally crossed a line. That would have been easier to identify, easier to respond to. Instead, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, alone in my office, with the door half open and the building unusually quiet. I was reviewing a revised financial summary that had been forwarded to me for awareness. The phrasing itself had become familiar. It meant I was expected to know what was in it, but not to change it. Halfway down the page, a line item caught my attention. A reclassification, one that moved a significant portion of short-term debt from a general corporate category into an operational reserve account, an account that fell squarely under my division's oversight. I read it again, slowly. The numbers weren't wrong. The language wasn't sloppy. It had been done carefully, legally, and with just enough ambiguity to pass without raising alarms. But the implication was unmistakable. If the company failed to meet certain revenue thresholds, that debt would appear, on paper, as an operational shortfall. Mine. I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic, not fear. Clarity. I pulled previous versions of the document, compared timestamps, followed the change trail. The adjustment had been introduced after a closed-door executive session I hadn't been invited to. I hadn't approved it, but I had been positioned to carry it. That was the moment. Not the first cut, not the normalization, not the role itself. The realization that the structure I was inside wasn't just limiting my influence, it was actively redistributing risk in my direction. And it was doing so quietly enough that if challenged later, it could be framed as oversight, or misunderstanding, or implied consent. I leaned back in my chair and looked around my office, the framed commendations on the wall, the tidy shelves, the leather-bound notebook I'd kept for years, filled with observations I'd never intended to use as evidence. I thought about how often I'd been described as steady, how often I'd been thanked for not overreacting. I understood then what that steadiness had purchased. Silence. I didn't storm out, I didn't send an email, I didn't confront anyone. I did something much quieter. I stopped explaining things away. I stopped assuming there had been no intention. I didn't assign malice, but I no longer assigned innocence either. There's a difference. That afternoon, I closed my door for the first time in months and began reviewing everything with a different lens. Not, can this work, but who carries the downside if it doesn't? Patterns emerged quickly once I asked the right question. I could see how my department had become the repository for uncertainty, how decisions were made optimistically, with the implicit understanding that operations would figure it out, how financial exposure was being described in language that subtly transferred ownership downward, and how my presence, calm, capable, unquestioning, made that transfer easier. I felt a brief flicker of something that might have been anger. It passed. What replaced it was resolve, not loud or dramatic, but precise. I wasn't going to argue about intent. I wasn't going to demand recognition. I wasn't going to threaten or expose. I was going to understand the system fully. Because systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to alignment or withdrawal. That day, I made a decision that no one else noticed. I would stop absorbing impact by default. I would stop smoothing over structural risk without documentation. And most importantly, I would stop assuming that silence was neutral. Silence, I realized, was either surrender or leverage. Which one it became would depend on how intentionally I used it. I closed the financial report, placed it neatly back in its folder, and reached for my notebook. On a fresh page, I wrote a single line. If responsibility is being assigned, authority must be traced. I didn't know yet what I would do with that insight, but I knew I would never unread it. After that day, nothing changed on the surface. That was intentional. I still arrived early. I still spoke calmly in meetings. I still answered questions with precision and restraint. If anyone was watching for signs of resistance, they would have found none. But internally, my silence had shifted shape. Before, it had been reflexive, an instinct to keep things smooth, to avoid unnecessary friction. Now it was deliberate, observational, strategic. I stopped volunteering solutions the moment a problem was mentioned. That alone felt unnatural. When someone said, "We might run into issues here," I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't say, "We can work around it." I asked clarifying questions instead. Clarifying. Who approved this timeline? What assumptions are those numbers based on? Where is that risk currently being tracked? The questions were neutral, professional, impossible to object to. And yet I noticed the shift immediately. People became more careful when speaking around me. Not defensive, just slightly more precise. As if they sensed that the buffer they'd grown used to was thinning. I also began documenting in ways I hadn't before. Not aggressively, not conspicuously. I summarized meetings in writing and circulated notes framed as alignment recaps. I asked for confirmation on assumptions that had previously lived in the air. I referenced prior discussions gently, with dates and context. Nothing I did could be called confrontational, but it created a record, and records change behavior. What surprised me most was how often people interpreted my quiet as continued compliance. They mistook restraint for acquiescence. When I didn't push back, they assumed I agreed. When I didn't raise concerns immediately, they assumed there were none. When I didn't volunteer fixes, they assumed fixes would appear anyway. That assumption had always worked in their favor. Now it was becoming visible. I remember a meeting where a senior leader outlined an aggressive cost-saving initiative. The plan depended heavily on operational efficiencies that hadn't been defined. In the past, I would have filled the gap. I would have translated aspiration into execution. This time I said, "We'll need to see the detailed assumptions before confirming feasibility." That was all. The room moved on. A week later, I was asked privately why operations hadn't begun adjustments. I replied calmly, "We're waiting on finalized parameters. Once those are confirmed in writing, we can assess." No accusation, no emotion, just accuracy. I could feel the dynamic changing, not dramatically but unmistakably. Requests that had once been open-ended became more specific. Decisions that had once been implied were now being stated more clearly. And with clarity came accountability. What I didn't do was warn anyone of what I was seeing. I didn't say, "This exposes us," or "This puts my department at risk." I let the structure speak for itself. There's a misconception that silence is passive. It isn't. Silence, when chosen, becomes a mirror. It reflects the assumptions others are making and forces them to confront those assumptions when outcomes don't align. I was no longer interested in being the person who made everything work regardless of cost. I was interested in being accurate. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Some people became impatient, others became cautious. A few began to loop me in earlier, seeking confirmation rather than cleanup. None of them knew why I'd changed. They just felt the difference. I also noticed something else, something internal. I felt steadier than I had in months, not because I felt powerful, but because I felt aligned. I wasn't performing calmness. I wasn't suppressing discomfort. I wasn't negotiating with myself after every meeting. I was simply choosing when to speak and when not to. And that choice carried weight. The irony is that the quieter I became, the more visible the structure around me grew. Gaps appeared where I'd once filled them. Risks became harder to ignore when they weren't being softened. And still, no one confronted me. They didn't see resistance. They saw continuity, which was exactly what made the next phase possible. What they never noticed was how much I was learning by stepping back. When you stop rushing to fix things, you gain time to observe how problems are actually created. Not in theory, not in mission statements, but in patterns of behavior, in who speaks first, who confirms, and who quietly carries the aftermath. I began to see the organization as a system rather than a collection of personalities. That shift was everything. I mapped decision flows in my notebook, not formally, not in diagrams that could be discovered, but in dated entries. Who proposed what? Who approved it? Who wasn't present? Where objections were redirected instead of addressed. I wasn't collecting evidence for confrontation. I was building comprehension. Every large decision followed a similar arc. Optimism at the top, compression in the middle, absorption at the bottom. I lived in the middle. I had access to executive intent and operational reality. I could see where language blurred just enough to create deniability later, where phrases like operational flexibility masked financial exposure, where empowerment meant responsibility without resources. They assumed my role kept me busy. It did, but not in the way they thought. I spent time learning the precise mechanics of how liability moved through the company, which signatures mattered, which approvals were symbolic, which committees created cover rather than direction. I reviewed historical incidents quietly, past restructures, past write-downs, past departures that had been explained as personal decisions. Patterns again. Operations leads who exited after performance issues, finance adjustments that appeared after strategic pivots, titles that sounded elevated but coincided with shrinking authority. None of this was secret. It was simply dispersed, too fragmented to notice unless you were looking for alignment. I was. I also learned how much influence came not from speaking but from timing. I watched who was invited into early conversations and who was brought in after conclusions had been reached. I noted how often I appeared in the second category, trusted to implement, not to shape. And I noticed how often my presence was used to reassure others. She's on it. Operations will handle it. Harper's overseeing that. My name had become shorthand for containment, so I stopped offering that comfort automatically. I didn't announce my withdrawal. I didn't make it visible. I simply allowed questions to remain unanswered longer. I allowed ambiguity to persist where clarity had not been granted. And I watched how quickly pressure traveled upward when it had nowhere else to go. This wasn't sabotage. I didn't withhold work. I fulfilled my responsibilities exactly as defined. No more, no less. That distinction mattered. The system had relied on my willingness to exceed my role quietly. Once that excess disappeared, the true shape of authority was exposed. During this time, I also deepened my understanding of the company's financial structure, not just budgets, but obligations, deferred payments, personal guarantees, contingent liabilities tied to operational benchmarks. The kind of details that don't surface in high-level reviews, but determine who answers when something collapses. I learned which debts were shared and which were quietly assigned, and I learned how easily titles could be used to anchor those assignments. Deputy Director, close enough to leadership to imply consent, far enough from power to limit resistance. It was an elegant design. I began to understand that my promotion had not been a reward. It had been a structural decision. They needed someone credible to sit between ambition and accountability. Someone who wouldn't alarm investors. Someone who could absorb complexity without broadcasting strain. Someone like me. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I knew now that if something went wrong, explanations would travel the path of least resistance. And that path ran directly through my title. So I prepared, not defensively but methodically. I ensured that my scope was clearly defined in writing. I clarified decision boundaries without challenging them. I asked for confirmations that had once been assumed. Each step was small, reasonable, impossible to argue against. And each step shifted the weight ever so slightly away from me. They never noticed the preparation because it looked like professionalism. They mistook my calm for compliance. What they didn't see was that I was no longer inside the system the way I had been. I was studying it. And once you understand the architecture of a structure, you stop fearing its shadows. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time I uncovered it, I already sensed the shape of what I would find. Still, seeing it laid out, quietly, incontrovertibly, changed how I breathed in that building from that day forward. It happened late one evening, long after most of the office had emptied. I hadn't planned to stay late. I was gathering documents for a routine internal review, one of those catch-all exercises meant to reassure rather than interrogate. In the process, I traced a chain I hadn't followed all the way before, a set of amendments, a supplemental agreement, an internal memo attached so casually it almost disappeared. Individually, they meant little. Together, they formed something precise. Certain financial obligations, short-term debt tied to aggressive expansion, had been structured so that accountability flowed downward in the event of underperformance. Not legally, in a way that would raise alarms externally, structurally internally. Operational leadership was named as the responsible executor. Performance metrics were defined in operational terms. Failure triggers were framed as execution gaps, not strategic miscalculations. And my title sat neatly at the intersection of all three. I read the language slowly, more than once, not searching for loopholes, searching for intent. What struck me most wasn't that this had been done. It was how cleanly it had been done. No single document assigned blame. No one signature carried responsibility. It was distributed just enough to avoid scrutiny, but aligned enough to function if needed. If the company missed their targets, the narrative would write itself. Operations failed to deliver. Oversight didn't catch the inefficiencies. Execution lagged behind vision. And there I would be, deputy director, visible enough to answer for it, insufficiently empowered to redirect it. This wasn't paranoia. It was design. I closed the file and sat still for a long moment. No anger surged. No urge to confront. No impulse to call anyone. What I felt was something quieter, heavier. Finality. The understanding that the ambiguity I'd lived inside wasn't accidental. It had served a purpose. And that purpose had been fulfilled the moment I accepted the title without demanding clarity on authority. I thought about how often I'd been praised for my discretion. How often I'd been trusted with sensitive details, but not decisive power. How often I'd been positioned as close enough to leadership. This was why. I was never meant to be a voice. I was meant to be an anchor. That night, I didn't copy files or forward emails to myself. I didn't need to. I already had what mattered: understanding. The system only works when someone remains inside it unknowingly. Once you see the mechanics, you gain a different kind of leverage. Not the loud kind, the irreversible kind. I documented the discovery carefully in my notebook. Not as evidence, but as orientation. Dates, language, implications. And then I closed it. Because clarity doesn't demand immediate action. It demands correct action. In the days that followed, I moved differently. Not outwardly, but internally. I stopped imagining alternate explanations. I stopped hoping for benevolence. I stopped believing that performance alone could correct structure. The truth was simpler and colder. I had been elevated to contain risk. And now that I knew it, the question was no longer what they intended. The question was what I would do with the knowledge. There were options. I could confront leadership and force a discussion, risking denial and political isolation. I could resign abruptly, protecting myself but abandoning the field. Or I could step aside in a way that made the design visible without spectacle. I didn't choose immediately. I let the clarity settle. I let the implications unfold fully. Because once you act from understanding, not emotion, there's no need to rush. And once you move, there's no need to explain. Once you see the structure clearly, indecision becomes impossible. Not because the choice is easy, but because pretending there is no choice becomes dishonest. For the first time since I joined the company, I stopped thinking in terms of endurance. I wasn't asking myself how much more I could absorb or how long I could stay steady. I was asking a different question. Which action preserves alignment between responsibility and agency? There were, realistically, 3 paths forward. The first was confrontation. I could request a closed-door meeting, lay out what I'd found, ask for clarification, redistribution of authority, formal protection. On paper, it sounded reasonable. Adult, professional, collaborative. But I understood the system too well by then. Confrontation would trigger defensiveness, not correction. The language would soften. Intent would be denied. I'd be reassured, praised for my diligence, and told not to worry. Nothing structural would change. What would change was how I was perceived. I would no longer be the calm constant. I would become a variable. And variables are managed. The second path was immediate exit. I could resign quietly, offer a polished explanation about personal priorities or professional growth, remove myself from the equation entirely. That option held a certain appeal. It was clean, fast, protective, but it also allowed the structure to remain intact. Another person would step into the same role, inherit the same ambiguity, and unknowingly absorb the same risk. Leaving without shifting anything felt like consent after the fact. The third path was slower and irreversible. It involved doing less, not more. Not disappearing, not confronting, but withdrawing my excess alignment with a system that depended on it. I would remain in my role, but only within its formally defined boundaries. I would no longer act as connective tissue between decisions and consequences. No cushioning, no translation, no silent absorption. I would let the structure operate without me compensating for it. This option required patience. It required trust, not in people but in systems. Because systems, when deprived of their buffers, reveal themselves quickly. I thought carefully about what this meant in practice. It meant no longer preemptively solving problems that hadn't been assigned to my scope. It meant asking for written confirmation where ambiguity had once sufficed. It meant declining responsibility for outcomes tied to decisions I hadn't approved. Not defensively, not emotionally, simply accurately. This wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment. If leadership wanted authority centralized, then accountability needed to remain there too. If they wanted me to carry risk, then power needed to follow. Absent that, the only ethical option was to stop pretending the mismatch was sustainable. I decided quietly. No announcement. No internal monologue worthy of drama. Just a clean internal line I would not cross again. I would not protect the system from itself. The next morning I came in as usual. Same posture, same tone, same schedule. But when a senior leader casually said, "We'll rely on operations to smooth that out," I replied, "Once the final parameters are confirmed and approved, we can assess feasibility within our scope." It was a small sentence, but it shifted something. In the days that followed, I repeated that stance consistently. Not stubbornly, not aggressively, consistently. Requests that assumed my department would absorb uncertainty began to stall. Decisions that had once flowed downward began to circle back upward, looking for somewhere to land. I didn't block them. I simply didn't catch them mid-fall. That was the decision. Not to fight, not to flee, but to stop standing underneath. I knew then that whatever followed, confusion, frustration, consequences, it would not be reversible. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like integrity. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. That was the point. I didn't change my schedule. I didn't reduce my hours. I didn't withdraw from conversations or signal disengagement. I continued to do my job, precisely as it was defined, not as it had been silently expanded over time. The shift was internal, procedural, and almost impossible to notice unless you depended on my excess labor to keep things afloat. I began by tightening language. Where I once said, "We'll handle this," I now said, "Operations can proceed once approval is documented." Where I once summarized decisions as consensus, I now documented them as direction. Where I once interpreted intent, I now asked for confirmation. These weren't acts of defiance, they were acts of accuracy. I also became meticulous about boundaries. If a decision originated outside my authority, I treated it that way all the way through execution. I no longer reframed strategic risk as operational challenge. I no longer reclassified uncertainty as solvable logistics. This didn't slow my work, it slowed the system. Approvals took longer, emails multiplied, questions returned to their senders instead of settling neatly into my department, and still, no one called it out. At first, people assumed it was temporary, a busy season, a backlog, an adjustment period. They trusted the system to correct itself, because it always had. What they didn't realize was that I had been the correction. Legally, financially, strategically, I made no sudden moves. I didn't consult lawyers or external advisors. I didn't escalate concerns beyond appropriate channels. Everything I did fit within policy, which made it impossible to challenge without exposing the very design they relied on. I remember one finance review where projected numbers didn't reconcile cleanly. In the past, I would have worked with my team to redistribute internal resources and mask the discrepancy. This time, I flagged it formally and asked how leadership wanted to proceed. The room grew quiet, not tense, uncertain. They weren't used to being asked that question. Someone suggested revisiting assumptions later. Someone else proposed operational flexibility. I nodded, took notes, and asked for confirmation in writing. The numbers remained unresolved. That was new. I could feel the subtle anxiety building. Not toward me, but around me. Like air pressure changing before a storm no one wanted to name. Still, no one confronted me. Why would they? I hadn't broken rules. I hadn't challenged authority. I hadn't refused responsibility. I had simply stopped donating myself to ambiguity. As weeks passed, the consequences of that withdrawal began to ripple outward. Projects slowed. Vendors asked for clarity that hadn't been required before. Internal teams hesitated to commit without documented backing. And leadership began to feel something unfamiliar. Exposure. Not because anything had gone wrong yet, but because nothing was absorbing the possibility that it might. That's the thing about systems built on quiet buffers. They feel stable until the buffer steps aside. I wasn't announcing my presence. I was removing my silence. And silence, when withdrawn, creates noise. The first signs weren't dramatic. No alarms, no emergency meetings, no sudden blame. Just a subtle discomfort that began to surface in places where confidence had once lived comfortably. A vendor asked for written confirmation before extending terms they'd always extended before. A department head hesitated to commit to a timeline without executive sign-off. Finance requested clarification on assumptions that had previously passed unchallenged. Individually, these moments meant nothing. Collectively, they marked the beginning. What leadership felt first wasn't failure, it was friction. Things required effort again. The kind of effort that can't be outsourced downward. I noticed how often questions began circling without landing. How emails returned unanswered, then resurfaced days later with new names added. How meetings ended without resolution, because no one present wanted to own the decision. The buffer was gone. Not removed, not dismantled, just no longer compensating. And because no one had acknowledged its existence, no one knew how to replace it. I could feel the shift in how people spoke to me. Not accusatory, not hostile. Careful. They asked more questions before assuming. They phrased requests with qualifiers. They waited for my response instead of moving ahead. In some ways, it looked like respect. But it wasn't respect for me. It was respect for exposure. During one leadership review, projected margins were lower than expected. The room circled explanations. Market volatility, timing issues, external constraints. Eventually, someone said, operations might be able to tighten execution. In the past, that sentence would have ended the discussion. This time it didn't. I said, we'll need to understand which assumptions you'd like adjusted and who's approving the trade-offs. No challenge, no edge, just accuracy. The silence that followed was different from before. Not dismissive, unsettled. Because now, for the first time, the weight of the decision sat where it belonged, waiting to be picked up. I watched people experience something unfamiliar. Accountability without insulation. They didn't blame me, they didn't even look at me. They looked at each other, and that was new. The consequences arrived quietly, but they compounded. Timelines slipped, not catastrophically, just enough to be noticed. Financial projections required revision. Confidence in forecasts softened. No one could point to a single cause. There was no crisis to rally against, just a growing awareness that the system wasn't as self-correcting as it had once appeared. I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't rescue. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain. I continued to do my job with clarity and restraint, and because I didn't dramatize the change, it took time for anyone to connect it to me. That delay mattered. It allowed the consequences to feel structural, not personal. People began asking different questions. Not why isn't this working, but who owns this? And ownership, once questioned, becomes visible very quickly. What struck me most was how little resistance there was. No one accused me of withholding effort. No one suggested I wasn't being a team player, because I was still doing everything I had agreed to do. I simply wasn't doing what I'd never agreed to carry. That distinction protected me. The discomfort in the room wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the absence of something no one had named before. A quiet realization was taking hold, though not yet fully formed. The company had been leaning on someone it hadn't fully acknowledged, and now without that support, it had to stand on its own. By the time panic appeared, it was already misplaced. That's the nature of delayed recognition. You don't panic at the cause. You panic at the moment you realize the cause can no longer be undone. The first real shift came disguised as urgency. Suddenly, meetings were being scheduled with tighter timelines. Language sharpened. Phrases like course correction and alignment reset began circulating. Leadership wanted answers, quick ones, not explanations, solutions. But the problem wasn't that solutions didn't exist. It was that the people now asking for them had never practiced holding the weight required to choose among them. They wanted decisiveness without exposure, speed without ownership. And I could feel, unmistakably, that they wanted the old version of me back. The one who would quietly translate chaos into coherence. The one who would smooth over consequences before they hardened into facts. The one who would absorb discomfort so others could continue forward unimpeded. But that version of me no longer existed. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted leverage, but because reversing now would mean accepting responsibility for a structure I had already seen clearly. And clarity, once reached, doesn't allow retreat. I remember a particularly tense leadership session where numbers were being revisited for the third time in 2 weeks. The margins were thinning, timelines were colliding. No single adjustment could fix everything without creating new exposure somewhere else. Someone finally said what had been circling the room. Why didn't we see this earlier? The question landed with more weight than intended, because the answer was obvious and deeply inconvenient. They had seen it. They just hadn't held it. All eyes moved briefly in my direction, not accusatory, searching, as if hoping I would speak up and reinterpret the past in a way that made the present less uncomfortable. I didn't. I waited. Eventually, someone suggested forming a task force. Another proposed reallocating authority temporarily. A third floated the idea of restructuring reporting lines. All of it sounded proactive. All of it was too late. Because the issue wasn't organizational design going forward. It was accountability going backward. The risk had already been distributed. The decisions had already been made. The records already existed. No amount of retroactive alignment could change that. What they were really asking for, though no one said it aloud, was for me to resume my old function, to become the buffer again, to take responsibility informally so others wouldn't have to acknowledge it formally. And this time the request was visible, not explicit but unmistakable. They needed me to stand underneath the consequences long enough for them to step away. I felt a moment of something close to grief, not for the role, not for the company, for the illusion that things could still be made clean. I responded the only way that remained honest, calmly, precisely. We can address what falls within operations approved scope, I said. Anything beyond that will need direction and ownership at the appropriate level. No emotion, no subtext, just truth. The room shifted, not into anger but into resignation, because everyone there understood what that meant. Fixing this would require visibility. Visibility would require accountability, and accountability would require names. They had waited too long to keep those names out of it. After that meeting, the tone changed again. Less urgency, more restraint. They weren't trying to fix it anymore. They were trying to contain it. And containment without a buffer has limits. I could feel it then. The point of no return had been crossed. Not because of anything I had done dramatically, but because I had refused, quietly and consistently, to undo the truth once it became visible. And in systems like this, that refusal is irreversible. What followed wasn't collapse. That's the part people misunderstand. Systems rarely fall apart the moment they fail. They adapt, they compress, they reroute pressure. They look functional, We're right up until the exact point they can no longer pretend someone else is holding the weight. After that meeting, I noticed the subtle recalibrations. I was no longer invited early. Information arrived later, already filtered, already framed. Questions became narrower, safer, designed to elicit confirmation rather than judgment. This wasn't retaliation. It was self-preservation. A system that senses it can no longer offload responsibility, doesn't confront the truth directly. It minimizes contact with the person who reflects it too clearly. And clarity, once recognized, becomes dangerous. Not because it's loud, but because it removes plausible deniability. They stopped asking, "What should we do?" and started asking, "What can we say?" That distinction matters because strategy is about navigating reality. Narrative is about surviving perception. I could feel myself being repositioned, not pushed out, not blamed, but gently sidelined from the center of consequence. That's when I understood something critical. I was no longer being evaluated for usefulness. I was being evaluated for containment risk. Would I speak if asked directly? Would I document what others preferred to leave implied? Would I insist on clarity where ambiguity still provided cover? I didn't need to answer those questions. My previous refusal already had. And systems remember, there was a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when I realized the reversal was complete. A proposal circulated, one that mirrored an earlier structure I had explicitly warned against months before. Same logic, same fragility, new language. Ooh, this time it came without my input, not because I hadn't been available, but because including me would require acknowledging why it had failed the first time. I read the document carefully, not to critique it, but to confirm what it revealed. Every risk was softened into an assumption. Every dependency reframed as an opportunity. Every unresolved exposure labeled manageable. It was elegant and structurally dishonest. That's when it became clear. They weren't rebuilding anymore. They were reperforming stability. And performance, unlike repair, doesn't tolerate witnesses who remember the original cracks. I said nothing. Not out of avoidance, but out of precision. Because at this stage, intervention wouldn't change the outcome. It would only delay recognition. And recognition delayed too long arrives as shock. There's a particular loneliness in this phase. Not the loneliness of exclusion, the loneliness of seeing the ending before others feel it. You move through meetings like someone already in the future, listening to plans that assume conditions which no longer exist. You hear optimism that depends on silence. You watch capable people negotiate with reality instead of confronting it, because confrontation would cost them identity, status, or certainty. And you realize this is no longer about competence. It's about who can afford to know. At some point, someone will ask again, "How did this happen?" And the answer will be the same. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't unforeseeable, it wasn't unfixable when it mattered. It became inevitable the moment responsibility was outsourced to someone who eventually stopped accepting it. That's the part systems don't plan for. They assume buffers are permanent. They assume translators will keep translating. They assume absorbers will keep absorbing. They never ask what happens when the buffer becomes conscious. Because consciousness introduces boundaries, and boundaries expose structure. The irony is this. By the time the system recognizes it can't lean on you anymore, it's already too late to replace you. Not because you were indispensable, but because the role you played was never formalized. It lived in the gaps, in the silences, in the decisions that never made it to paper. Once those gaps are exposed, no title can absorb them. No task force can hold them. No restructuring can erase the record of who chose and who didn't. So the system does the only thing it can. It tightens, it slows, it protects itself from further exposure. And eventually, it fractures, not loudly, not cleanly, but internally, where trust used to compensate for design. I didn't leave immediately, not because I believed it could be saved, but because departure too communicates something. Leaving too early looks like escape. Leaving too late looks like complicity. There's a narrow window where staying long enough to remain credible, but not long enough to be responsible, becomes its own act of integrity. That's the final paradox. You don't step away when things break. You step away when you're no longer being asked to pretend they haven't. And once you reach that point, the system already knows. You're not coming back to carry it. Not now, not again. There's a myth that when you stop carrying a system, you feel relief. Sometimes you do. But more often, what comes first is disorientation. Because for a long time, your value wasn't measured by what you built, but by what didn't collapse. By how much friction never reached the surface because you absorbed it quietly. When you step out of that position, the absence is subtle at first. Meetings still happen. Plans still circulate. Metrics still report progress. But the tone shifts. There's more checking, less confidence, more approvals, fewer instincts, more language around risk mitigation, less actual risk being confronted, and people start behaving differently around you, not colder, more careful, as if unsure whether you're still part of the structure or now something adjacent to it. This is the cost no one prepares you for. You don't lose relevance overnight. You lose informal gravity, the quiet pull that once brought decisions toward you before they hardened. The unspoken assumption that if something was unclear, you would clarify it. Without that gravity, decisions still get made, but they drift. And drift creates distance. Distance creates narrative. I began to notice how often my name was omitted. Not intentionally, but conveniently. I assumed you were looped in. We thought this was already aligned. It seemed within scope. These phrases aren't lies. They're cushions. They soften the moment when responsibility should land somewhere specific. And once you're no longer the fall, those cushions get thicker. Here's the hardest part to admit. Some people resent you for stopping. Not openly, not maliciously, but internally, because your refusal forces them to feel the weight they'd grown used to avoiding. And weight, when unfamiliar, feels unfair. They don't see your boundary as integrity. They see it as withdrawal. As if you changed the rules mid-game, forgetting that you were never the one who agreed to play this role in the first place. I had to sit with that discomfort, the impulse to explain, to justify, to reassure them I was still on their side. But doing that would reinsert me into the very function I'd stepped out of. So I didn't. I let silence do what explanation couldn't. And silence has a way of revealing what words conceal. Some people leaned in, asked clearer questions, took firmer ownership, recalibrated their approach. Others leaned away, reducing interaction, keeping exchanges transactional, avoiding moments where judgment might be required. Both reactions were instructive, because they revealed who had been collaborating with me and who had been relying on me. There's a difference. Collaboration survives boundaries. Reliance doesn't. Over time, I noticed something else. The system didn't punish me, it reclassified me. From infrastructure to resource, from someone embedded in the flow to someone consulted selectively. This isn't demotion. It's a form of insulation. Resources are used when needed. Infrastructure is depended on constantly. And once you stop being infrastructure, your absence becomes visible. Not dramatic, but cumulative. Small delays, miscommunications, decisions that take longer to settle. No single failure points back to you. That's the thing about invisible labor. Its removal doesn't create explosions. It creates erosion. And erosion takes time to be acknowledged. There were moments I questioned myself. Could I have stayed differently? Could I have set boundaries earlier? Could I have transitioned the weight more gently? These are honest questions, but they rest on a flawed assumption that systems want to be transitioned. Most don't. They want continuity without awareness. They want the benefits of absorption without naming the absorber. And once you name it, even silently, it changes the contract. Eventually, something breaks enough to require explanation, not catastrophe. Just enough friction to trigger review. And in those reviews, patterns emerge, not accusations, just traces. This was delayed. That assumption didn't hold. This decision lacked a clear owner. And slowly, the absence of the fall becomes legible, not as a loss, but as a structural fact. That's when the cost becomes mutual. You lose the comfort of being needed. They lose the convenience of not knowing. Neither side escapes untouched, but only one side gains freedom. And freedom in this context isn't lightness. It's responsibility returned to its rightful place. That's the cost. And it's worth paying, not because it feels good, but because it ends the lie that your worth was measured by how much you could disappear for others. When you stop being the fall, you don't rise. You stand. And standing after a long time underneath changes everything. There is a quiet ending to stories like this that rarely gets told. Not the collapse, not the exposure, not the moment when someone finally admits, we should have listened. The real ending is much less cinematic. It's the moment you realize you are no longer emotionally available to be misused. No anger, no triumph, no need for an audience. Just a clean internal boundary where confusion used to live. For a long time, I believed my value was proven through endurance. That being reliable meant being endlessly absorbent. That leadership was about preventing consequences rather than assigning them. Those beliefs weren't forced on me. I adopted them willingly because they were rewarded. Praise came quietly. Trust came implicitly. Responsibility came without title, without protection, without authority. And I mistook that for respect. The truth is harder, but more freeing. Systems don't exploit people because they are cruel. They exploit people because someone is willing to carry what others won't. And the moment that willingness ends, the system doesn't collapse. It recalibrates, slowly, awkwardly, sometimes resentfully, but it recalibrates. Looking back, I don't regret the work I did. It taught me discernment. It taught me precision. It taught me how power actually moves. Not through titles, but through tolerated patterns. What I regret is only this, that it took clarity to believe I was allowed to stop. No one had to give me permission to step out of the fall. No confrontation was required. No declaration was necessary. I simply stopped compensating for decisions that weren't mine to own. And that single change did more than any argument ever could. Because when you stop absorbing, truth has nowhere left to hide. The story didn't end with applause. It didn't end with vindication. It ended with alignment. My actions matched my understanding. My boundaries matched my role. My silence matched my integrity. And that alignment, that quiet coherence, is the real dominance no one teaches you to claim. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's not a strategy. It's a question you can ask yourself gently and honestly. What am I still carrying that only exists because I've been willing to carry it? Because the moment you see that clearly, you'll realize something profound. You don't need to prove your strength. You don't need to expose anyone else's failure. You don't need to be louder, sharper, or harder. Sometimes the most decisive act is simply refusing to undo reality for others. I'll leave you with one final question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been given responsibility without authority and mistaken it for recognition? And if so, what happened when you finally stopped holding it together? That's where the real conversation begins.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.